Okay, good evening. My name is Dave Pomater. I'm here to moderate a discussion among my three learned colleagues about the merits of the recent ministerial agreement of the WTO ministers in Bali. Not to take their time, let me just move to my far left is Bernard Hoekman of the European University Institute, Professor Rob Howse of New York University, and Professor Petros Mavroidis of the Institute. They will each speak for 5 minutes, and then they will have a cross discussion and question each other. Bernard, do you want to begin?
Sure. Yeah. Okay, so the main takeaway that I had from the Bali ministerial is that finally we have some positive news in terms of an agreement having been struck in the context of WTO negotiations, which have been going on since 2001 and really have been gridlocked in a state of abeyance for quite a while, so this was really good news. I think it's also good for the new Director General of the WTO to actually have delivered some positive momentum to the institution. I think we're probably going to have a discussion in terms of what is the substance of what was negotiated. My view is that the agreement on trade facilitation is actually quite important, especially for developing countries. Given all the research that has been done in this area over the last decade or so by economists, showing that really one of the main impediments to trade nowadays is really very high trade costs. So trade facilitation will help bring those costs down and will help firms in developing countries in particular get entry into global supply chains and expand employment opportunities in developing countries. Now, how much is going to kind of come out of that trade facilitation agreement is something we really don't know. A lot is going to depend on what kind of commitments countries take. It's a very kind of innovative agreement in the sense that it has a whole countries, especially developing countries, are free to select themselves which commitments they implement immediately, which commitments they will implement over time, but also which commitments they will only implement conditional on receiving development assistance from high-income countries. So I think one important thing that still is to be determined is to what extent will the large emerging economies like India, like Brazil, what kind of commitments are they going to take in the context of actually implementing the trade facilitation agreement. I think the other big item on the Bali agenda, which I'm sure we're going to discuss, was the insistence by India to get greater flexibility to use production subsidies for agricultural production in the context of a food security program that it maintains. I would argue from an economic perspective, this is a step backward in terms of the insistence on using those types of instruments to try and achieve food security objectives, but I think it's also quite understandable that India was quite insistent on this, because you can also look at this as essentially a rebalancing of the deal that was struck in the Uruguay round, which was rather unbalanced in the sense that developed countries have much more scope to use these types of subsidies because they had much more. That's something they've been using for a long time. So I think we have this tension there between the economics in terms of does this make sense as opposed to the balance within the WTO on this. We can come back to this later in terms of the economics of this particular issue. I think the big question right now is how are members going to deal with the mandate that was given to them by ministers, which was essentially come up with a work program to finish the rest of the Doha development agenda. And I think this is, of course, a huge challenge given that they've not been able to close that particular deal in the last 12 years or so. And I think here one of the big issues, which I'm sure we'll come back to, is to what extent will countries be willing to kind of go beyond the agenda of the negotiations to start talking about what are sometimes called 21st century trade policy and investment related types of issues. My view is that if they don't go down the track of actually expanding the agenda, not so much in terms of negotiating, but at least to start a process of discussing as to how they might pursue cooperation in areas like export restrictions, in areas like industrial policies, subsidies, whether they're put under a green renewable hat or whether we're talking about investment incentives. There's a lot of policies that are creating negative effects for other countries that simply are not on the agenda right now, and that arguably should be, because that's what the WTO is really for. The WTO is an instrument to help countries deal with the negative spillovers of policies that other countries pursue. So just a number of questions that I think confront WTO members is how serious are countries actually in terms of using the multilateral trading system for what it was designed to do, which is to deal with these types of policy spillovers. And I think that is an open question, given the lack of movement on many of the Doha issues over the last decade and more. Is there a willingness to kind of go and allow countries to do more in subgroups? So the WTO provides for plurilateral agreements, for example. Petros and I have been writing on this in the last year or so, arguing that there should be greater use made of these agreements. We don't really understand why, in a sense, WTO members are being told, you either do things on a multilateral MFN basis, or you go off and negotiate a preferential trade agreements with your friends. The WTO does offer some opportunities to work with and to cooperate with countries that are like-minded within the context of the WTO mechanisms. Whether issues are being addressed or will be addressed on an MFN or a plurilateral basis, I would argue that we really need to have more of a focus in the WTO looking forward to actually kind of have a discussion on these types of issues that are not on the Doha agenda, and that I'm sure we're going to come back to. So more of a deliberative process to try and understand what the effects are of policies and where there's scope for cooperation. And the final kind of, I think, big challenge, which I'm sure will come back again and again in this discussion, and it certainly is something that everybody was talking about in Bali, is what are the implications of the mega regional agreements that the EU and the US and other countries are negotiating at the moment. We have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we have the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and we have the Trade and Services negotiations among a group of 20 plus countries. And I think what comes out of those agreements is really going to be quite important in defining where we go in the WTO process looking forward. Those agreements might be very successful. That's one scenario. Another scenario is that those agreements will really fail to go much beyond what we have today in the WTO, and that will then generate another set of dynamics in terms of moving forward. We don't know what the outcome is going to be, and I'm sure we'll come back to this in the course of this discussion. So, thanks, David.
Thank you, Bernard. Rob?
So I think that Bernard has given a terrific tour d'horizon of the issues that we need to be thinking about and discussing this evening. I would begin by saying that I was in many ways a skeptic about whether one could see the possibility of any real progress at Bali, or indeed whether the Doha agenda itself was going to be a plausible way for the WTO to move forward. And in this respect, I'm happy to have been proven wrong, because I think that the Bali outcome does suggest that I've been proven wrong on that score. I may have been proven right on a different point, which was my support for Roberto Azevedo as the new WTO DG, because I think that, in fact, much of the success of Bali, not all of it obviously, because it required a great deal of vision and flexibility by a number of the major players in the trading system, but a significant part of the credit can be given to Azevedo, whose style of leadership and negotiation, I think it's fair to say, are considerably different from those of Pascal Lamy. And once Azevedo perhaps stopped listening so much to the people around the WTO who were leftovers from the Lamy era and came into his own, it seems to me that we saw a very different and much more positive style of leadership emerging in the organization. Now, why in particular can one characterize the Bali outcome as a success? It can't be anything as simplistic as to say, well, there's an agreement or we've moved beyond a complete impasse. By contrast, it seems to me that there are a number of features of what was negotiated and how it was structured that are very promising in terms of developing a future vision for the WTO as a multilateral regime. And I'll just say a few words about these features, and that relates to some of the observations that Bernard has already made. And in doing so, I'm going to draw on work in progress with my Oxford colleague, Calypso Nicolaides, with whom I'm writing an essay on an ethical vision for the future of the WTO. First of all, balance. As Bernard already pointed out, there is an element of real balance that is embedded, for example, in the flexibility that was negotiated with respect to food security. And whether or not one thinks that, as Bernard says, the policy instruments in question that have been adopted by India are optimal or lousy to achieve its objective, the important point of principle, which he's already made, is that this is a real balance. And when it was announced that Doha would be a development round, the implication, it seems to me, that many developing countries rightly drew from it was that you would have an adjustment or a rebalancing of some of the unbalanced features in the Uruguay round. But as it turned out, many other players in the system were highly resistant. And so one of the reasons I was skeptical that one would make any progress with the Doha agenda was, in fact, that it seemed to be based upon a real conflict of understanding or expectations about what a development round means. And in the balance in the agricultural or food security aspects of the agreement, one can see that this is a genuine development round in the sense that there is the rebalancing that Bernard pointed to. I think that also what we're seeing with the trade facilitation text is a meaning to special and differential treatment, which is a lot more profound than hitherto in the WTO. It's really, to use an expression of Danny Roderick's, doing trade policy as if development really matters. And why do I say that? Because the final trade facilitation draft matches commitments and capacities. It doesn't say to developing countries, you have these hard law obligations that kick in immediately, and then we'll see about giving you some assistance down the road in order to be able to have the capabilities to meet those obligations. It calibrates and times the kicking in of the obligations to the development of the capacities and the availability of the assistance that's needed, at least in many cases, to bring those capacities to the level that would normatively justify undertaking hard law obligations. And this brings me to a final observation that relates to one of the questions that people sent in for us to address. And it's more of a kind of architectural question. In a sense, it seems to me that one of the positive things about Bali is that, if not in a technical legal sense, in the sense of the spirit of multilateralism, it represents a real movement away from the single undertaking, one deal, a model, and towards or maybe even back to the future, in a sense, a more flexible view of obligations, that they're going to be developed incrementally over time, that you're going to have elements of soft law as well as hard law. And you're going to also be able to accommodate the fact that you have a very, very diverse membership, and that you can do multilateral arrangements at different speeds for different members, and with a certain degree of asymmetry. And it seems to me that this last development is absolutely crucial in order to compete with regional agreements or mega regional agreements that obviously can be much more tailored to the specific demands and circumstances of individual countries. But multilateralism can be flexible and asymmetrical as well. And it was really just the theology of the Uruguay round, the straitjacket mentality represented by the single undertaking, that moved us outside of that wisdom, which Keynes and Kojève and others who were architects of the original GATT had, that one could have a great deal of a subtlety and flexibility within a multilateral regime.
Thanks, Rob. And Petros?
Grazie, Davide. To me, the Bali is as much a success as it is an opportunity. I mean, what do I mean by success? Success because Bernard said it first, 12 years down the road, after 12 years of nonchalance, impossibility to do anything, we managed at the very least to come up with something. Now, to me, this is much more important than the substance of the agreement, because the substance potentially can be powerful. As things stand nowadays, if I'm a developing country, I put everything in category B, and I say I will implement trade facilitation after 40 years. And if you want me to go faster, you pay, and you pay through technical assistance. I mean, I think it is inevitable that there will be negotiations in order to shorten the time period for implementation, and those who are willing to pay will pay in order to see the agreement implemented. But as I said, to me this is secondary thought. The most important thing is that something finally has been agreed. Now, why do I say opportunity? Because in my view, until the end of the Uruguay round, we lived in a world where the framers of the GATT were essentially more or less the only game in town. They had the mentality that brought GATT into place in the first place. They kept going, and for 40 years they had a free ride, essentially. There were few preferential agreements still up to when the Uruguay round started. The original spirit of the GATT could carry on, and did carry on for 50 years. Nowadays, I think it's impossible for the WTO to think about the post-Bali agenda without rethinking its own persona. The WTO has to come to grips with reality. The WTO has to understand that nowadays, PTAs do run away with the agenda. I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist. You open TTIP or you open TPP or you open any PTA nowadays, especially those signed by the EU and the US. And the first thing you remark is that there is a huge discrepancy between the preferential and the trade agenda, the multilateral trade agenda. So we need to catch up. The WTO needs to catch up. And to me, this will be the challenge in this year. I mean, I wish Roberto Azevedo best of luck. He will need a lot of luck and he will need a lot of persuasion. But I think for the WTO to capitalize on Bali's success, it will have to come up with an agenda that will essentially provide some signals as to how do we view the WTO in the years to come. Rob made this point. I will repeat it in a different way. We have to understand that WTO will be a very unstable equilibrium with deep integration between 159. It's impossible. So we have to make room for PTAs, as long as PTAs build on the multilateral agenda. We have to make room for plurilaterals. We have to make room for critical mass agreements. The WTO can have a role and should have a role against this background, but has to rethink its dimension.
Thank you, Petros. Who wants to begin with the comments?
I think that one aspect of what Petros has quite rightly just said is also there have to be some signals and some real thinking about the relationship between the WTO and other international institutions and regimes. And this is something that's been very weakly and poorly developed up to this point. And just to come back, for example, to the food security arrangements in the Bali agreement, there are some concepts in those arrangements, such as that in using flexibilities for food security purposes, a member cannot undermine other states' food security. That's really a principle of global justice. I mean, how is one going to interpret and apply that principle, which requires an important balance? Well, here, some of the work of the Food and Agriculture Organization on food security is going to be important, and also the work of the UN Human Rights institutions on the right to food and articulating what those concepts actually mean and how you can balance food security of the regulating state with the food security of other states. I don't think there's any, conceptual tools that can adequately do the job within the idiom or the lexicon of WTO law itself. But there are tools if one goes to these other legal regimes that are concerned with, in various ways, food security and indeed food justice. So that's just one example. On issues of currency and exchange rates, not explicitly discussed at Bali, but increasingly a topic of concern. If the WTO, as has been, I think, the attitude of the Secretariat, and was very much the attitude of Lamy, the ostrich with the head in the sand attitude, if you just leave it to the IMF, that's just not good enough, because principles of trade justice and balance of rights and responsibilities mean that you have to think about the currency issue in various kinds of idioms, not just the idiom in which the fund thinks about it.
I think on this food security question, I think it illustrates exactly why we need the WTO. Because this whole issue of kind of dealing with and trying to identify the policies that are most efficient and effective in actually promoting food security is not something that is going to be kind of highly prominent on the agenda of these regional types of agreements. So, if you think about what are the policies that actually impact on food security, a number of them are already on the agenda in terms of the WTO. So that's production support, import subsidies, import restrictions. But we haven't been talking much about export restrictions in the WTO context. And if you think about kind of the importance of having access to food, if in a time of shortage your net exporting countries shut off their exports because they're trying to defend and to safeguard the interests of their own people, which is eminently understandable from the perspective of any government, but nonetheless that imposes a huge negative shock on the rest of the world, and in particular countries that are highly dependent on imports of food. And again, so this is not something that it's not going to appear on the agenda of TTIP, it's not going to appear on the agenda of the TPP. So this is, again, kind of the type of issue that the WTO really should be focusing on, and I think it's quite important. Just to kind of follow up on one of the points that Rob made in terms of greater linkages to other organizations, I think, again, here is an example where there really is much more of a need to have much more dialogue on the substance of policies. And so like I said, I think it's fully understandable that countries are trying to rebalance the rules in terms of negotiating what they have, what policy space they have. But it's always struck me that in the WTO context, there's way too much weight put on trade policy types of instruments to achieve a large number of objectives. And as economists know, you need an instrument per objective, and essentially what we're trying to do quite frequently is to use trade policy for purposes for which it's really very inefficient, if it's effective at all. And I think here, there's been a lot of work done on kind of the extent to which the Indian food program actually works in terms of helping the poor. And I think what we really need to be focusing on is how can you make that program much more efficient and kind of steer governments towards helping them use the instruments that are more efficient. And I think that's not something the WTO can do, but I think it is something where greater cooperation with other organizations like the FAO would really make potentially a big difference. And we wouldn't get into these, what I thought was a very bizarre discussion and essentially fight in Bali, where a lot of people were saying the WTO is against food security. right? Which seems to me is kind of obviously wrong, because it's not, but it's really about how can you use instruments that are the least trade distorting in terms of getting you towards achieving that objective of food security, which really means using other instruments. And I think that's a bit the same, I guess that's a parallel to your exchange rate example, where again, those instruments obviously have big impacts in terms of achieving the objectives that governments have. And we need to kind of focus more of an attention on what policies actually make sense towards achieving particular objectives. And I think that's the deliberative process that I mentioned briefly in my introductory comment. I think we need a lot more of that discussion in the WTO.
I mean, to me, the question would be, of course, at one point in time, how much of these questions WTO members are prepared to outsource to international institutions, because the WTO is built on this concept of negative integration. This is how the WTO has functioned so far. Now, the moment we start discussing these type of issues, we essentially move to a more de-resist model, where we say, look, here is what you should be doing at home, because, of course, anything affects trade. And we can start in food security and finish God knows where. Quite frankly, I don't know to what extent this is something which is, I would say, in French we say la musique d'aujourd'hui, if it is something which we should be prioritizing at this moment. I think, in my view, that the most important issue is, how does the WTO view itself? They must come to grips with their own identity. How does it view itself in today's world where, because of the success of the GATT, we live in a world without tariffs? And when you live in a world without tariffs, integration or market segmentation, they say the opposite, because of regulatory barriers, is not something you can easily address across 159 countries with divergent development level, divergent cultures, divergent everything. Now, this is to me the key for the WTO to decide, probably even this year. Azevedo has a lot of discretion and should have a lot of discretion, especially because he delivered where nobody else delivered before him in the last 12 years. And I think he should be focusing on this issue. I mean, what can WTO do from now on to keep its policy relevance, irrespective of specific issues, in a world essentially segmented through regulatory barriers?
And here I think, and this also comes back to something Bernard said about export restrictions on food and agricultural products and their effects, that one way of refocusing that would be to say that the specific role of the WTO is to address above all cases where the negative externalities of trade or trade-related policies are global negative externalities, so that if you unilaterally impose export restrictions on food, you can create price spikes in global markets that have a global harm. And so, you know, the negative externality is not limited regionally or to the country taking the measures. Well, that's where you need a multilateral regime. Similarly, with energy subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies, as recent studies by the IMF have shown, they have a significant global negative externality, which is their effects on climate change, and that's been quite effectively quantified. Well, there again, because the externality is global, you'll only really capture it if you address that through a genuinely multilateral regime. And that's another area, by the way, where Lamy had his head in the sand, and then when he left the WTO, or around the time he left, he said, oh, it was a missed opportunity not to address fossil fuel subsidies. Well, he was the leader of the organization, and he was the one who missed the opportunity. But I think we have an opportunity now, but the more general point is that focusing the mission on areas where there are global externalities really suggests a particular focus that can't be fully met by regional or bilateral arrangements.
Let me ask you just a general question, would the WTO have the capability of doing something in these other substantive areas without really conflicting with existing bodies that presumably have some expertise and some authority over them. For example, on the exchange rate, that's a big issue with the U.S. right now with vis-a-vis China. In the past, it's been with Japan. With the Japanese, it was simply head-to-head negotiations and banging over to get some satisfactory result from the U.S. viewpoint. But I have a hard time seeing what the WTO could do if it decided that that's something, that was a problem. How would they go about it? What measures could they take? What agreements could be negotiated? What kind of a regime could exist to handle a problem like that?
Well, I would say that what is above all needed is to bridge the existing, legal norms, which are from the Bretton Woods era, with the realities of global finance today. Whether you do that by amendment or interpretation, perhaps through rulemaking in a WTO committee, and through a broad approach that involves not only the IMF, but let's say UNCTAD, the UN, and to some extent cooperation with domestic authorities, agreement among central bankers, whatever. It's an institutional challenge, but I think conceptually, if you go back to the GATT, right, and there's a wonderful book by Ben Stile on the battle for Bretton Woods. This was clearly, very much on the minds of Keynes and others, the relationship between trade and exchange rates. But obviously, the way it got resolved in the Bretton Woods framework, which includes, in some sense, the original GATT, was through at least the convention of a gold standard or currency adjustments relative to some, at least, artifice of an objective standard. So how do we, again, build the bridge to the world of global finance today? That's the issue. I think that the understanding of the existence of externalities that could be imposed by the exchange rate policy of one state on another with trade impacts was acknowledged by Keynes and all the others right from the start. But how do you deal with it in a very different world where, as we know, exchange rates are determined, quite differently today?
I think I think it's an important issue, but I think it's also an extremely complex issue, and there are very good reasons why the IMF has such trouble in terms of identifying, what the issues might be in a particular context. So I think it does make sense to kind of pursue the path that has already been initiated in the WTO context, to at least discuss this, right? So you can think about working parties, you can think about kind of the institutional mechanisms just to at least have that discussion. But I think if we're trying to think about binding rules of the game, or we're trying to, again, and I think here would I go back to my previous point, given that the WTO is about trade and trade policy instruments, I think the notion that we're going to use trade policy to offset misaligned currencies or currency manipulation, or however it is defined, is a very slippery slope that can very easily unravel the whole trading system. So I think we definitely don't want to go there. So I think the type of provisions that are being bandied about by some members of Congress in terms of what they would like to see in the TPP, I think that's a recipe for no cooperation down the road and potentially trade wars, which we don't want. But I think focusing on the effects, understanding what countries are doing, is very important. And I think I think nobody, I don't know what you guys think, but given that the WTO's focus is on trade, whereas the IMF's focus is not, right? So different institutions have different mandates. I think having that type of a more focused discussion in the WTO makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, I have nothing to add to this.
I totally
Same
agree
wavelength.
with you, Bernard, that going down a kind of trade remedy route is a disaster and totally unjustified in this area. But, deliberation about, the significance of persistent trade imbalances and related questions, there needs to be a multilateral deliberative forum that addresses the trade dimensions. And in a way, it should be the WTO in close relationship to the other relevant institutions.
We had a couple of questions from the web, so we might want to address some of those. Right, so we had a couple of questions that came from people who would like us to discuss specific issues.
Well, one was services, and I don't know, Bernard, if you want to say something about the future of services negotiations after Bali.
Yeah, so one of the questions was on the trade and services agreement negotiations, and I think there, I would go back to what I said in the beginning, which is, the proof of the pudding is going to be very much in the eating. So this is an exercise among, I think at this count, something like 23 countries that are negotiating. So it's very much a subset of the WTO membership. And if you think to yourself, what are the implications of an agreement on services for the trading system? Again, it's going to depend a lot on what is actually agreed among these countries. I think if you look at the countries that are involved, many of them already have free trade agreements with each other. So if you think what on the margin is going to change in terms of additional market access, I think we have a bit the same problem that we have in the TPP context before Japan joined, is that essentially this is a negotiation among countries that already pretty much have negotiated most of the things they had to negotiate in market access terms at any rate. So we'll have to see what comes out of that process. I think what is really important, though, is, there's a bunch of questions that arise here. One of them is, what will the current set of countries that are negotiating, how will they actually deal with requests for other countries to join the negotiations? And I think here, what I hear about the way that China, the reaction to China's request to join the negotiations, I think is really quite worrisome in the sense that, some of the countries, I guess the US is insisting that China actually kind of commits to doing a whole bunch of things before they're allowed to participate in the negotiations. I think that's really the wrong way to go about these types of things. I think at the end of the day, a lot is going to depend, especially in terms of future multilateralization of any agreement on services, is this services agreement going to be compatible with the GATS in terms of the structure? Or not. And if these countries decide that, well, we're going to use this opportunity to kind of rethink how you design rules for liberalization of trade and investment and services, then again, that opens a much bigger question for the WTO membership as a whole. And again, that might not be bad, because there's lots of things that I think, looking back, the negotiators who put the GATS together might have done things quite differently if they were asked to negotiate that agreement now. So I think a lot depends on what's going to come out of that process. And at the end of the day, from an economic perspective, it's not all that clear how much you can actually do in a discriminatory way in the services context, right? So if we're talking about regulation, and Petros's point, and then if one of the implications of the trade and services agreement is that the members agree on certain ways of approaching regulation, that is likely to be on a non-discriminatory basis. You're not going to design a regulatory regime just for one set of countries and apply a different one to another set of countries. That's really only something you can do if we're talking about kind of market access restrictions, if there are quotas or there are quantitative restrictions on being able to service a market. So from that point of view, there might not be a whole lot of concern with respect to what might come out of an agreement insofar as they go down that route.
And I would add to that, actually, that with respect to regional agreements, rules of origin on, even if you could have differentiated regulation, rules of origin with respect to services are going to be even more of a headache than with respect to goods, because with services, it's basically the regulated, entity, and try to determine the nationality of a service provider. I work a lot in the investor-state arbitration area, and these nationality issues have already become very complex. You can perhaps use a formal concept of incorporation, but that becomes, very artificial. Sorry, Petros.
No, it's fine. I wanted just to go back to what Bernard said, which I think is a very, very valuable point. If you speak about what kind of statutory requirements an entity must have to be accepted as a bank in my market, or what kind of requirements should a surgeon fulfill to be in position to practice in my market, this can never be can never be discriminatory. That's why I'm very worried about this negotiation on services, because if this is the type of issues they discuss and not just quotas, well then, to me, it is a very, I would say, worrying signal that the negotiation takes place outside the WTO. It will be the first major trade negotiation ever that will take place outside the WTO. This cannot be a preferential trade agreement if you discuss licensing, qualification, and so on. And they will be negotiating this type of stuff. So to me, it's imperative that they find a way to bring the TISA negotiation under the aegis of the WTO.
And I would add to that, I totally agree, that in a sense, one other kind of question that we've been given is the WTO playing an impossible game of catch-up with these regional negotiations? And one point I would make, building on something you said, Petros, is that this kind of deep integration, first of all, these negotiations are non-transparent by and large. And this kind of deep integration, when the resulting agreements are going to be put before parliaments, this is not going to be an easy exercise. In some cases, there may be constitutional issues that are actually raised when you get deeply into certain regulatory areas. So I believe that there will be a big price to be paid for not engaging in these negotiations transparently at the point at which the states in question, have to go before their publics and their legislative institutions and explain what they need to do in terms of changing all kinds of various laws, which may be laws or regulations in a federal system that have to be changed at a lower level of governance. And so I don't think that the regional negotiations are as ahead as one might think at first glance. What they have done is they've created a legitimacy challenge to the WTO, because when you open up a magazine or newspaper, to the extent that they talk about the WTO at all, they talk about these other exciting negotiations, barreling ahead. In a way, that's a nice thing about Bali. It's a beginning to answering that kind of legitimacy challenge. But I remember the multilateral agreement on investment and the price that was paid for non-transparency there. And I think that price will be paid also with the regional negotiations. One of the amazing areas of progress in the WTO, to my mind, as a critic of its non-transparency in the past, has been on this very issue. I mean, if you take the trade facilitation agreement, you could go on the WTO website every month or 2 months, and you would see the new version of the rolling draft, of the agreement. And yet, those who are negotiating these regional arrangements believe that for some reason they have to hide that, and whenever you see any draft, it's always a leak, which gives rise to more and more suspicion and frustration about what might be going on behind closed doors.
I mean, you're right. I mean, there is one area where the WTO, I think, will continue to be, at least in the foreseeable future, by construction relevant, and that's dispute settlement. This is the only truly multilateral dispute settlement which has compulsory third-party adjudication. And it's not. I'm not speaking about the quality of the output. I'm speaking about the mechanics. I mean, the mechanics are there, and this is an area where the quality could be a contributing factor to keep to ensure the longevity of the relevance. No.
Well, we'll take a look at the North American Free Trade Agreement.
Exactly.
We already have, an empirical study which is that if you take disputes that can be brought by the parties to NAFTA, in NAFTA, or alternately at the WTO, they generally choose the WTO. There have been only 1 or 2 disputes in the whole history of NAFTA, where the parties have gone to the NAFTA dispute settlement mechanism as opposed to WTO. Now, obviously, in the investment area where there's no comparable
That's
dispute
different,
settlement, it's different. But where you have a comparable issue that could be resolved in the WTO forum, the NAFTA parties choose the WTO.
You know, Rob, it's something like 520 PTAs nowadays.
Right.
Over 50% of them have their own dispute settlement mechanism, and none of them dwarfs WTO in terms of norm. They prefer to go to the multilateral
So
forum.
what do you guys think of this argument, which I think has been mainly made by lawyers, to kind of let the WTO become the dispute settlement mechanism for regional agreements? To let parties that have signed regional agreements go to the WTO and say, can you guys help us out here and enforce what we agreed to do bilaterally?
If they pay for it. I mean, this is a serious problem now. It's ironic that the one, as Petros says, the one area where it's uncontroversial that, you know, the WTO system has a very strong comparative advantage. You know, according to Azevedo at least, the system is now being badly, you know, underfunded in terms of what's required to move the, you know, existing number and complexity of disputes forward in an expeditious and professional fashion.
You know, one point on the NAFTA issue you raised, thinking back in my years as a practitioner, a client would normally prefer to go to the WTO and be advised by a lawyer to go there simply because of the expertise and the reasonable objectivity. In NAFTA, you still have roles to be played by national institutions of one member or another. There really is nothing comparable to an international intra-NAFTA bureaucracy. And it doesn't have the developed law. You're dealing, and most of those were trade cases, trade remedy cases, and you'd be dealing with ad hoc panelists with lurking conflict of interest problems in a lot of instances. So it's just simply the developed body of law, the knowledge of the institution, the predictability of the WTO far exceeds what NAFTA could offer. Is a general proposition.
I mean, I think the conflict of interest practices could be tightened up in the WTO, but I agree with you. It's nothing or very little compared to what we have, for example, in investor state dispute settlement, where there's a very weak, you know, notion of conflict of interest. You know, to the extent that it's quite acceptable that someone be an arbitrator in one case and be counsel in another pending case where similar legal issues that they will be deciding as arbitrator will be issues that they'll have to argue as counsel on one side. I mean, you know, that's a far more serious kind of problem than the conflict of interest issues that arise in the WTO context. But there are a few.
But there are as well. I mean,
yeah, there are.
I mean, if you look at the identity of panelists, the overwhelming majority, they are delegates in Geneva. I mean, I cannot believe for once that if I'm in New Zealand, let's say delegate, and I have a case Chile against the US, I might think of the repercussions of the outcome for my domestic law eventually. I mean, how immune can you be, especially since I make my career in the national administration?
But you compare that to NAFTA.
I agree. I mean,
where
it's always,
where NAFTA panelists were people like me who were practicing lawyers, had other cases before these same governmental institutions or with other clients, you know, and that existed. And again, what you have in the WTO, particularly as I think as the body of jurisprudence, the case law has developed, is in the secretariat an expertise that can often overwhelm a neophyte panelist who just couldn't stand up to the secretariat and a lot of stuff like that. So that's really probably where there's a lot more power now than there was at the start, and I suspect something like that's going on in the appellate body as well.
You want to, there was one question on climate change.
Yeah. Do you have a question? on climate change?
Petros is the resident expert on climate change
expert is he?
on this particular sofa.
Is the climate changing?
Climate
Is
change
the
at
climate
WTO.
changing? That's the question. You know, I mean, the role of the WTO in this discussion, in my view, I mean, cannot be a role of, let's debate the substance. I mean, this should be left to those who know. The WTO, if at all, can discuss measures taken in the name of climate change protection. And that should be normally disputes. Now, every time there was a negotiation on environment, and let's beef up the environmental leg of the WTO, it ended up nowhere. I mean, now there's an ongoing negotiation for 12 years on environmental goods. God knows, they're still in the beginning, square one. So to me, the only meaningful contribution I can see of the WTO in the near future in this area is how will the WTO deal with, let's say, cases concerning the legality of border tax adjustments and stuff like that. Now, if this is the correct reading of the situation, Rob knows my views. I'm not a...
But we don't know your views.
Yeah, no, that's precisely why I continue. I'm very skeptical of the WTO case law non-discrimination. To me, WTO has to understand that when we did the GATT, and the reason we did the GATT was because we wanted to outlaw one set of policies, protectionist policies. If I design my policy to protect environment, and by accident, those who don't meet my standards, they stay out of my market, tough luck. WTO, the trade liberalization should not trump social preferences. Trade liberalization is there to augment, and I'm a free trader, to augment the pie, increase the size of income, but not to subordinate social policy in the name of international trade liberalization. I think the WTO should rethink its understanding of non-discrimination. And to do that, they should rethink what on earth these guys meant. Well, they open the negotiating history, actually, which they never do. It's very clear there that what they wanted to outlaw is 5% duties on value-added tax or consumption tax on domestic butter and 50 on imported. So I undo the value of the tariff preference. They didn't want to say 5% on domestic butter as opposed to 50 on foreign, if foreign butter carries salmonella. Of course you can do that. I mean, I want to protect myself against protectionism. I don't want to protect myself against health policy or against the environmental policy objectives.
I would only add again that it seems to me that there's no other place but the WTO where you could have an effective multilateral negotiation on, a reduction of fossil fuel subsidies. And I see no reason why some kind of adaptation of the agreement on agriculture methodology couldn't work for those. And as I've already suggested, that could have a very positive, effect on climate change. I mean, Petros is right that the negotiations on environmental goods and services, it's been a tremendous waste of time and energy, very frustrating because of kind of very narrow focus on defining what is an environmental good and how do you classify them under the harmonized system. I mean, most of these issues can easily be solved. They've been used by whatever interested parties to frustrate these negotiations. Now we have a breakthrough in APEC on a list of environmental goods and some interest on the part of the Obama administration in multilateralizing that through the WTO. It's to my knowledge, the only instance where Obama has ever suggested that the WTO could contribute positively to any policy priority of his administration. And so you would think that that would be some reason to, renew interest in these negotiations and to try and starting from what was agreed in APEC to think out of the box about how you can have a successful outcome.
Are you all talked out?
Yeah, I think
Okay, well, then I want to thank the three of you just again. Bernard Hoekman, Rob Howse, Petros Mavroidis.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.